But I wanted to know the same thing as Alex. Look, when the rubber hits the road, did Jesus walk out of the tomb? Because that's the claim.
One of my favorite conversations I've seen you have is with Alex O'Connor. I believe you recently had him on for the launch of your book. You guys had a conversation, which was really cool. I also remember several years back, he had a conversation with a jet-lagged Frank Turek in studio. Yes. And I thought that went really well, but there was parts where they seemed like they were, I don't know, maybe misunderstanding each other. So Alex O'Connor had this conversation with Jordan Peterson, which for me was like, man, this is it, right? Like this is for Christians, we wanted these answers from Jordan, and Alex got them for us, which was, hey, if you had a time machine and a video camera, and we went back in time, and we went to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would we see a bodily risen Jesus coming out? And Jordan gave him the answer, which is yes. You know, he affirms the
on
bodily
balance,
resurrection.
he said, yeah, I think probably.
Yeah. What did he say? I suppose so, I think was the exact word, or something like that, which kind of shocks Alex. Alex is like,
okay, this isn't just a purely psychological Jungian symbolic thing.
Okay. Because that's how people kind of hear Jordan Peterson talk about these things. Now, he then goes on to present the Gnostic Gospels as his thesis of, well, maybe maybe Jesus rose in the sense that the Gnostics believe, and that, and he goes on and on about the Gnostics, and felt well knowing some of the outlandish claims in the Gnostics, like Jesus telling the apostles that I believe it was Mary would have to become a man
in order to
be saved. Like the ridiculous stuff in the Gnostic Gospels. It was debunked and called a heresy within the first century. Like what this is, and yet there's just this fascination. And a lot of my friends who've deconverted or deconstructed all of a sudden circle back to the Gnostics because it gives you this out of a bodily resurrection that has a radical implication on us. And Alex seems to be very intrigued and flirting with it. What do you make of all of that? And it to me, it just comes off like such a cliche thing that people go through. It's like they don't like the bodily resurrection, so they're like, well, maybe the Gnostics were onto something. And Jordan rightfully rebukes him. Dr. Peterson rightfully rebukes him and was like, no, like that. This isn't good. This isn't right. You know.
Well, I want to first of all say I'm friends with Alex, and I kind of got to know him again before his kind of meteoric rise to fame. He's now just, I think, celebrated at the time of recording 850,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel. So but I knew him when he was like a 16-year-old teenager in his bedroom, just kind of making kind of snarky response to Christian type videos. And it was actually him making a kind of snarky response to one of my videos that kind of actually led to me meeting him and bringing him on my show and having some great conversations. He's evolved an awful lot himself, actually. He kind of says he went through that kind of teenage Hitchens atheist phase. He's kind of past that. He went and did a theology degree at Oxford, for goodness sake. So he's actually really immersed himself in the best arguments for faith. He's actually got a lot of Christian friends around him now. And so I find that, and he will willingly kind of look back at some of his early videos and say, I was wrong. I was dismissive. I didn't understand that argument. So I think there's a lot of humility to Alex. I really like that about him. And I've really enjoyed the conversations that we've shared together. I also really appreciated him holding Jordan Peterson's feet to the fire and saying, look, exactly. I was like, go Alex, when I heard him saying, look, just tell us what you think. Did it really happen? Because for me, it is important. I love Jordan Peterson's kind of the bigger picture. I see an awful lot of symbolism and meaning in Scripture. I think he's done a fantastic service bringing that to the surface and helping people to just take Christianity seriously at an intellectual level. But I wanted to know the same thing as Alex. Look, when the rubber hits the road, did Jesus walk out of the tomb? Because that's the claim in Scripture, and that's what Paul says. If that didn't happen, our faith is worthless, it's futile, it's in vain. And so I was really intrigued, like you, to hear Jordan Peterson say, yeah, I think so. And for me, that's really important, actually, because you can have all the symbolism and psychology in the world. If Jesus didn't come back to life physically, that's the whole point. It's that this world, the material world of you and me, gets redeemed, restored, recreated by Jesus. Amen. He hasn't said goodbye to the physical world. He hasn't said, this doesn't really matter. It's all about just thoughts in your head and kind of floating off to some heavenly place. Actually, God cares about this world, about the fact we're embodied human beings. That's why he became a human, okay?
Which blows Gnosticism out of the water.
And that's the point.
The incarnation story is so
Gnostic
important.
version of Christianity was rejected as a heresy by the early church because it went back on that. It tried to roll that back. It basically got kind of corrupted by kind of basically a sort of the Greek ideas that actually the body's not good. You know, we don't like physicality. It's corrupt in some way. We just want to kind of live in this ethereal spiritual dimension. And so the Gnostics tried to separate again God from becoming physical and said, no, Jesus wasn't really a physical person. Maybe he kind of looked that way, but he was really just this heavenly thing. And no, Jesus didn't physically rise again. We don't like physical stuff. It was just a kind of spiritual thing. So yeah, there are those writings in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. You can find them. Alex has obviously discovered them recently. But the reason they're not in our Bible, the reason they're not alongside Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is because they were wrong. Is because that was a heresy. That was a contradiction of what the first Christians claimed about Jesus. It was physical, okay? Why is Alex interested in this? I think, you know, to be fair to Alex, what he's trying to say, I think, is, oh, well, there were different versions of Christianity that came about, okay? Your version, Justin, isn't the only version that was going, okay? People came up with different ideas about the resurrection. And I want to say, yeah, and they always have. People have always come up with different ideas about Jesus. But let's remember what these Gnostic Gospels are. They're much later, okay? They're late and they're fake, basically. They're like fan fiction about Jesus, about 100 to 200 years later. What you have in your Gospels is the earliest accounts of Jesus' life. And that's why they're there, is because the early church said, they were kind of just trying to decide what's going to be the authoritative canon, if you like. And they had some of these Gnostic Gospels kind of as options. Some people liked them, but they said, no, that won't do. They're too late and they're fake. They don't go back to the sources. If you read them, you only have to go and read them, and you'll find that they talk about Jesus, but in very vague terms. They talk about the disciples, but in very vague terms. They don't put him in locations. They don't use history. They don't use the language, the terminology of the era. You can tell that they're written at a distance by people who don't really understand.
Yeah.
And that's why we don't trust them. And so it's fine. You can point to them and you can say, hey, people had different ideas about Christianity. That's always been the case. But we know that they're not to be trusted. And the early Christians knew they weren't to be trusted. That's why we didn't include them in the Bible.
Yeah, or as if there's not other books that weren't included in the Bible. Like I think of First Clement, I think of the Didache. There's a lot of other stuff that he could be flirting with.
The Shepherd of Hermes. I mean, there was lots of stuff going, and not all of it was bad. I mean,
well,
some of these books were,
is great.
Yeah, exactly. Some of these books were important parts of, you know, the way Christians started to understand their faith and have a rule of life and these kind of things. But they didn't all make it. Obviously, they had to kind of decide, okay, well, what are we going to put as the deposit of faith, the thing we're going to pass on and say this is, and I think that was a needed process, and I don't mind. You know, I will read the Gnostics, and you might find some interesting stuff there, some helpful historical stuff, but I don't think that's what God gave us as kind of the authoritative account that He wanted to leave of who Jesus was and the difference He makes.
Yeah, I just find it interesting, the need or the seeming need to affirm books that give such an alternative version of who Jesus was, what he preached, and the claims of the incarnation and the resurrection, when there's books that weren't canonical, that were closer to the times of Jesus, that aren't as interesting to the skeptic.
Well, and there's a good reason, you know, why people kind of, things go viral, like some fragment of an early Gnostic gospel claiming Jesus had a wife. It's because people are kind of interested. They're titillated by that. It's different, isn't it? And obviously things like that often get disproved, as that fragment did. It was a forgery and everything else. But even if that was, you know, from the early centuries and so on, yeah, people kind of made this stuff up. There was this fan fiction going on. So it doesn't really make any bearing. The irony is that the reason we kind of run after some of these alternative theories and hypotheses about Jesus is because we're so used to the story of Jesus. And we think that's kind of boring. You know, that's why when Dan Brown, you know, writes the Da Vinci Code, it's like, exciting, an alternative theory. It was all a kind of cover up and, you know, Jesus really did have a wife and all the rest of it. When in fact, actually, the most controversial sort of countercultural story of Jesus that's ever been written was the one that was written in the Gospels. Because it's just we've become so familiar with it, we don't see how extraordinary, controversial, and compelling it was. This claim that God had become human and had experienced the death of a rebel slave on a cross, and then be raised to life. This was such a crazy, controversial claim in its day that Paul said, this is foolishness to the Gentiles, okay? Scandalous. It was completely out there, and yet this was what people said had happened. And I think we've lost that sense of just how extraordinarily scandalous and different and countercultural this story was, because it's kind of part of the fabric of our culture now. Yeah. But I think we should go back to the original story.
Well, because we take it for granted.
Yeah.
We live in such a Christianized world that we take this. It's like, it's like when you travel a lot, you could have these different delicacies and you can try these different foods and you can go to these different parts of the world. But I enjoy my wife's food the best. You know, like I enjoy home-cooked meals the best, the time with the family the best. And if you're not careful, you can quickly find the new novelty and the new thing and ignore the home and the good, you know? And I think that's kind of how like the Gospels are in Western culture.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, I think sometimes familiarity breeds contempt and like people chase after interesting new ideas and everything else. But actually, sometimes it's about Christians especially kind of approaching the Gospels kind of and maybe stripping away some of their cultural assumptions, getting behind the text. I found scholars like N.T. Wright so helpful in doing this, people who can kind of uncover a lot of what's going on around the Gospels that you may not get by just reading the Gospels, putting in its historical context, and suddenly it comes alive in a fresh way. You realize just how unusual this movement was. That's kind of what Tom Holland does as well in his book. He just kind of puts the finger on just how weird Christianity was in its day. You know, because today we say, well, of course, we should treat people equally. Men and women are equal. We should be compassionate, and so on. That's all kind of a given in our culture. It's only when you put those claims of the early Christians in its historical culture where you could basically treat some women as your sex slaves. That was the right of a free Roman man to basically have sex with whoever he wanted of an inferior, male or female, of an inferior rank. You could leave your children, if they were unwanted, out on the roadside to be eaten by wild animals or picked up by foreigners, because that was just the culture of the day. Why do we think of that as abhorrent today? It's because we've been Christianized. It's because the Christians took those children in.
That's what I was going to say,
They,
rescued
adopted
the babies,
them. They rescued them. It's because they said, no, it's not okay for you to have sex with whoever you want, whoever is your social inferior. We're going to say, if you're a man, you need to have one wife and you need to be faithful to her. That was absolutely crazy to the Romans. That went against all of their natural instincts as men. And yet this has become, faithfulness has become a kind of really important concept in Western culture. So I just think we need to recapture just how weird Christianity was in its first century context.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Comment down below and let me know what you think. And be sure to check out this video that YouTube is recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right? I'll see you over there. Peace.